The winter of 1944 in the Ardennes was unlike anything the American soldiers had yet endured. Snow fell relentlessly across the dense Belgian forests, covering the ground in a heavy white blanket that muffled every step and sound. Visibility was poor, the fog clinging low to the trees, and the air carried a biting cold that seeped through gloves and boots. Soldiers huddled in foxholes with frozen hands gripping their rifles, waiting for an attack they sensed but could not see. It was in this chilling silence that the sudden roar of German engines shattered the stillness, heralding the start of Hitler's last great gamble. The Battle of the Bulge began with shock and fury. Columns of German armor pushed through the trees, their engines echoing like thunder across the valley. To the Americans, the sight was almost surreal. Panthers and Tigers, massive and menacing, rolled forward as if unstoppable. Their armor glistened with ice, their guns trained on positions that seemed defenseless in comparison. The ground shook under the weight of steel, and with it came the realization that the Allies were in for a desperate fight. For many American soldiers, the first hours of the German offensive were defined by disbelief. Shells fired from their own weapons clanged harmlessly against the thick steel hides of the enemy tanks. Machine gun fire disappeared into the snow without effect. To those on the front lines, it was as if they were armed with little more than toys against an enemy fortress that moved. The sound of ricochets echoed in their ears, each one a reminder of the power gap that threatened to crush them. Fear spread quickly, and yet there was no choice but to stand and fight. The Ardennes campaign was not chosen by accident. Hitler believed the terrain, with its forests and narrow roads, would hide his forces until the last possible moment. The winter weather grounded Allied aircraft, depriving the Americans of their much-needed air superiority. In the silence of the woods, the sudden appearance of enemy armor seemed almost spectral. German troops advanced with confidence, supported by machines that had earned a reputation as invincible. The American lines buckled, stretched thin across miles of snow-covered ground. For the men holding those lines, the experience was deeply personal. Imagine being a young soldier, barely 20 years old, crouched in a frozen foxhole as the sound of engines grew louder. You clutched your rifle, your breath clouding in the icy air, and wondered whether you would survive the day. When the first German tanks came into view, their silhouettes looming through the mist, your heart pounded with the knowledge that your weapon could do little to stop them. The feeling of helplessness was as heavy as the snow pressing down on your shoulders. Every second carried with it the weight of dread. As the offensive unfolded, the Americans faced not only the physical threat of the tanks, but also the crushing psychological pressure they brought. Stories of the Tigers and Panthers had already spread, tales of their armor that could shrug off Allied shells and their guns that destroyed with terrifying precision. To meet them in the frozen forest felt like walking into a nightmare that had suddenly come alive. Units were overrun, villages were seized, and the once steady lines of the Allied front began to collapse. The German gamble was working, and the Americans struggled to find their footing. Yet even in those dark hours, there was resilience. Soldiers held crossroads, bridges, and frozen fields with a determination born of necessity. They knew that if they broke entirely, the path to the Meuse River would open, and the German advance could split the Allied armies in two. The Battle of the Bulge was not just a clash of weapons, but a clash of wills, fought in one of the harshest winters Europe had seen. Amid this chaos, whispers began to circulate of a new weapon that might finally stand against the armored beasts of the enemy. In the midst of despair, a faint spark of hope was beginning to flicker. From the first clash in the Ardennes, the imbalance between American and German armor was painfully clear. The Germans advanced with confidence, relying on their formidable tanks to do what they had done so many times before. The Tiger, with its thick frontal armor, seemed impervious to most Allied shells. The Panther, faster and more maneuverable, combined speed with nearly the same protection. Against such machines, American crews found themselves firing round after round with almost no effect. Each deflected shell was more than wasted ammunition. It was a reminder that their weapons were outmatched. For the men inside Shermans and light anti-tank units, the contrast was terrifying. They would watch their shots bounce off the German armor, only to see their own vehicles destroyed in return fire. The roar of an 80mm German gun was often the last sound a crew ever heard. Survivors recalled the helplessness of watching a Tiger approach, their own weapons unable to penetrate its hide. The battlefield became a place of fear and improvisation, where bravery often collided with the grim knowledge that firepower was not on their side. The Germans seemed to dominate not just with tanks, but with the aura of invulnerability their tanks projected. This disparity was not lost on commanders either. Reports circulated that existing American anti-tank weapons were struggling against the newer models of German armor. Morale wavered as tank crews realized that meeting an enemy Panther head-on was almost a death sentence. Soldiers began to rely more on ambushes, terrain, and sheer numbers, hoping to catch German tanks from the flanks or overwhelm them by attrition. Such strategies were desperate measures born of necessity rather than strength. The contrast between what the Germans fielded and what the Americans possessed was not only a technical issue, it was a psychological wound. The winter terrain magnified this difference. Narrow, snow-covered roads forced engagements at close range, where the superiority of German armor was most devastating. American gunners often had only seconds to act, knowing that even their best shots would rarely penetrate a Tiger from the front. Meanwhile, the Germans could fire with devastating accuracy from distances that seemed unreachable. Each battlefield encounter reinforced the same story. German tanks ruled the snow, while American weapons seemed powerless to challenge them. The gap in capability was as visible as the tank tracks pressed deep into the frozen ground. For American soldiers, the frustration was overwhelming. Imagine watching your comrades load shell after shell, only to see sparks fly as rounds bounced away without harm. Imagine hearing the calm confidence in the German radio chatter while your own unit scrambled for cover. This contrast between weaponry struck deep into the morale of those fighting in the Ardennes. It was not simply about losing ground. It was about facing an enemy who seemed untouchable. To fight under such conditions required not only courage, but the belief that something would eventually tip the scales. And so the stage was set. The Germans pressed their advantage with steel and fire, while the Americans clung to hope, endurance, and ingenuity. The imbalance in weapons was undeniable, and it defined the opening weeks of the battle. Yet history often turns on moments of adaptation, when the weak find new strength, and the strong find their edge dulled. In the cold forests of Belgium, that turning point was about to emerge. The weapon that could pierce the armor of the Panthers and Tigers was finally on its way. The arrival of the 90mm gun on the battlefield was not a matter of luck or coincidence. It was the product of months of urgency, as American military planners and engineers realized that the existing arsenal could not keep pace with German innovation. The Shermans had carried the war far, but by 1944 they were straining against the reality of superior German armor. Reports from the front painted a grim picture, with Allied shells failing to penetrate and crews suffering heavy losses. The question was no longer whether the United States needed a stronger weapon, but how quickly it could be delivered. Time was a luxury the battlefield did not offer. Behind the lines, American industry moved with the speed of wartime necessity. The design of the 90mm gun had been in progress, originally intended for anti-aircraft roles. Its adaptation for tank destroyers and heavy tanks became an urgent priority as the German threat grew clearer. Engineers reshaped it for the M36 tank destroyer, giving U.S. crews a weapon that could finally rival the enemy's armor. Later, it was mounted on the M26 Pershing, a tank designed to bring American firepower into a new era. Each adjustment was a response to the mounting evidence that the war could not be won with outdated tools. When word of the new weapon reached the front, it was met with cautious anticipation. Soldiers had heard promises before, and many had seen supposed solutions falter under real combat conditions. The 90mm gun carried with it the weight of expectation, a potential answer to a problem that had haunted the Allies since the first encounters with German heavy tanks. It was not simply a weapon of steel and powder, but a symbol of adaptation. For those who had felt helpless watching shells bounce off enemy tanks, the prospect of having something powerful enough to bite back was both thrilling and uncertain. The transition from theory to battlefield reality was swift. The M36 tank destroyer, armed with the new weapon, began to appear in small numbers, arriving in time for the desperate fighting of late 1944. Crews who received them understood the stakes. Each vehicle was more than just another machine. It was hope on tracks, a chance to face the feared German tanks on equal terms. The sense of relief was palpable, though it came with the knowledge that numbers were still limited. Every M36 and every 90mm gun mattered, and each had to be used wisely. For the men on the ground, this shift represented more than just a technical improvement. It was proof that their leaders and their country recognized the deadly reality of the battlefield and were acting to correct it. Morale rose when the first reports of successful engagements spread. Stories of German armor being penetrated by the 90mm traveled quickly through the ranks. After months of despair, the tide of belief began to change. Soldiers no longer felt they were being sent to fight impossible battles with inadequate weapons. The balance was not yet restored, but the first signs of hope were tangible. The origin of the 90mm gun was, in truth, a testament to American adaptability under pressure. It showed how necessity could drive innovation and how the demands of the battlefield could reshape the priorities of an entire military apparatus. The weapon's arrival did not happen in isolation. It was the direct result of soldiers' cries for help, commanders' recognition of hard truths, and the capacity of American industry to deliver under strain. In the story of the Battle of the Bulge, it was the bridge between despair and determination. The men who would soon fire those guns were about to discover just how much difference they could make. The Ardennes battlefield was a frozen nightmare of narrow roads, dense forests, and villages caught in the crossfire. For weeks, American units had fought desperately against German armor, watching their own shells bounce off enemy tanks with little effect. But when the 90mm gun finally entered the fight, the sound of its fire carried a new kind of promise. Crews who had felt powerless now gripped their weapons with renewed determination. Each time the massive gun roared, it was not just a shot at an enemy tank, but a strike against the fear that had haunted the Allies since the offensive began. The first real test came in ambushes along icy roads, where M36 tank destroyers lay in wait. As Panthers and Tigers advanced confidently, the Americans fired their 90mm rounds with deadly precision. For the first time, crews saw shells pierce armor that had once seemed invincible. The explosions of burning German tanks lit up the snowy forests, sending plumes of smoke into the cold sky. Soldiers watching from foxholes cheered, their spirits lifted by the sight of enemy steel finally torn open. The battlefield had shifted, and everyone knew it. Beyond the physical destruction, the psychological impact was immediate. American tank crews who had previously avoided head-on confrontations began to engage with greater confidence. Infantrymen, who once feared the approach of a Tiger, now held their ground, knowing support weapons could protect them. The German aura of invincibility began to crack, replaced by uncertainty in their own lines. Commanders who once pressed attacks with confidence now hesitated, knowing that American guns could answer with lethal force. The battlefield was no longer a place where only one side dictated the tempo. Each engagement told the same story. Where Shermans and lighter guns had faltered, the 90mm delivered. Soldiers recalled the thrill of seeing a Tiger stopped in its tracks, its armor split open by a single well-placed shot. For American units, these moments were more than tactical victories. They were proof that the tide could be turned. The sound of the 90mm became a rallying cry, echoing across frozen valleys and snow-covered hills. Every shot that hit its mark carried with it the weight of redemption, erasing weeks of frustration and fear. The weapon's effectiveness spread rapidly through the ranks. News of successful kills raced from unit to unit, fueling morale in ways no speech or order could achieve. Men who had once whispered about the hopelessness of facing German armor now spoke with pride about their ability to destroy it. The battlefield transformed from a place of dread into one of opportunity. American forces no longer felt like prey to the German tanks, but hunters capable of striking back with equal ferocity. In the heart of winter, hope returned with every thunderous recoil of the 90mm gun, yet the victories were not easy. The cold was merciless, freezing metal and men alike, and every battle carried the risk of destruction. German tanks still outnumbered and outgunned many American formations, and the struggle was far from over. But the balance had shifted. The 90mm did not erase the hardships of the Ardennes, but it gave soldiers a tool that restored their fighting spirit. Against the backdrop of snow, blood, and smoke, the gun carved its place as a decisive force. Its impact was measured not only in destroyed armor, but in the resilience it inspired. For those who fought in the Ardennes, the memory of the first time a 90mm shell struck true never faded. It was the sound of survival, the sight of fire consuming what once seemed untouchable. The battlefield had been changed by the arrival of a weapon that finally gave the Americans a fighting chance. The roar of the 90mm echoed across the Ardennes, a signal that the tide of battle was turning. In the midst of one of the harshest winters of the war, that sound carried with it a promise. The German advance could be stopped. The arrival of the 90mm gun on the battlefield did more than change the outcome of individual skirmishes. It altered the way American units thought about facing German armor. Before its appearance, encounters with Tigers and Panthers were dreaded events, battles that felt almost predetermined in favor of the enemy. But with the new weapon, soldiers began to rethink their strategies. Tank crews that had once relied on flanking maneuvers or retreat now stood their ground, confident that they could fight toe-to-toe. The psychological shift was as important as the tactical one, and it rippled through the ranks like a surge of electricity. In field reports, commanders noted a remarkable change in morale. Where once there had been hesitation and caution, there was now boldness. Infantrymen holding crossroads and villages knew that American tank destroyers equipped with 90mm guns could protect them from armored assaults. This belief gave them the courage to resist longer, to fight harder, and to deny the Germans the quick victories they had counted on. The weapon, in effect, gave the Allies back their will to contest every inch of ground, even in the face of overwhelming conditions. In the harsh winter of the Ardennes, that shift in morale meant everything. The Germans, too, felt the difference. Their tanks, which had rolled forward with an air of invulnerability, suddenly faced threats that could not be ignored. Panther and Tiger crews who once advanced with confidence began to exercise caution. The possibility of being destroyed by American firepower weighed heavily on their decisions. For the first time in the campaign, German commanders found themselves forced to reconsider tactics that had once seemed unquestionable. The myth of invincibility that had surrounded their machines was beginning to unravel. This consequence went beyond the immediate battlefield. Strategically, the 90mm gun demonstrated that American industry and innovation could respond effectively to German advances. It was a reassurance not just to the men at the front, but to Allied leadership as a whole. The weapon became a symbol of adaptation, proof that the United States could meet technological challenges head-on. For a war fought as much in factories as in forests, this mattered immensely. It reinforced confidence in the ability of Allied production to keep pace with, and eventually outstrip, that of Germany. For the ordinary soldier, however, the effect was more personal. Imagine standing in a village square, hearing the approach of German armor, and knowing that this time your side had the means to fight back. The fear that once paralyzed units in the face of tanks was replaced by determination. The gun was more than steel. It was reassurance, a kind of invisible shield that steadied shaking hands and lifted weary spirits. To the men who fought, it felt like the difference between hopeless resistance and a genuine chance at survival. That difference shaped how they fought and how long they could endure. The wider consequences also revealed themselves in the pace of the German offensive. With American resistance stiffened, German advances slowed. The delays gave Allied reinforcements time to arrive, closing gaps and stabilizing fragile lines. Each destroyed German tank was not just a tactical win, but a piece of momentum taken from the offensive. In this way, the 90mm contributed directly to blunting the spearhead of Hitler's gamble. It became one of the many small but critical edges that kept the Ardennes from becoming a catastrophic loss. Ultimately, the weapon's impact was measured in both steel and spirit. It destroyed enemy armor, but more importantly, it restored balance to a battlefield that had once been terrifyingly one-sided. The wider consequences stretched far beyond the snow-covered forests, reminding soldiers and commanders alike that war could still be won through adaptation. The 90mm was not simply a gun, it was a turning point in a desperate campaign. It ensured that when the Allies faced the worst the Germans had to offer, they could answer with strength of their own. The Battle of the Bulge reached its most desperate moments as German forces pushed deeper into the Ardennes. Entire American units were cut off, towns were captured, and the snow-covered roads became graveyards of broken vehicles. The weight of the German offensive threatened to split the Allied lines and drive to the Meuse River. For soldiers holding the line, the question was not simply whether they could resist, but whether they could survive at all. The roar of German engines echoed day and night, and the shadow of Panthers and Tigers loomed large over every engagement. It was here, at the peak of the crisis, that the full power of the 90mm gun came into focus. In the chaos of these days, American tank destroyer crews rose to the challenge. Positioned at key crossroads and narrow lanes, the M36 tank destroyers, armed with the 90mm gun, became the unexpected anchors of resistance. When German armor advanced, often believing it could not be stopped, these guns unleashed their fury. The result was dramatic. Tigers halted mid-road, Panthers bursting into flames, their black smoke curling skyward. For the first time in the Ardennes, the advancing tide of steel was checked not by retreat, but by firepower. The snow, once marked by tracks of German advance, was now littered with burned-out hulks. The climax of this clash was not just about the destruction of machines, but about the shift it created in human hearts. American crews, once fearful of engaging the enemy, now felt the rush of empowerment. Imagine the exhilaration of firing a round and watching it tear through armor that had once seemed impenetrable. The shock on the faces of German crews, the sudden halt of their confidence, became victories in themselves. Each successful strike carried more than tactical value. It carried vindication, the proof that the Americans could not only withstand the assault, but begin to turn it back. The battlefield itself seemed to roar with new determination. For the Germans, this was a crushing revelation. Their tanks, long the symbols of dominance, were now vulnerable in ways they had not anticipated. Crews that once pushed boldly forward now hesitated, aware that American firepower had reached a new level. The offensive, already strained by fuel shortages and difficult terrain, faltered under the weight of unexpected resistance. Where once the German advance seemed unstoppable, it now slowed to a crawl. The dream of splitting the Allied armies began to fade into the harsh reality of attrition. The climax of the Ardennes was not decided in a single battle, but in a series of clashes where the 90mm gun proved its worth. Each confrontation, each destroyed tank chipped away at the German momentum. Villages that might have fallen were held. Crossroads that could have opened new routes for the enemy remained blocked. The gun's thunder became part of the symphony of resistance, blending with rifle fire, artillery, and the cries of soldiers in the snow. The battlefield was alive with struggle, but for the first time, the balance was no longer tipped against the Americans. As days turned into weeks, the German advance lost its edge. What had begun as a bold gamble to break the Allied lines became a costly grind with little to show. The Americans, now reinforced and emboldened, began to push back. The 90mm gun had done more than destroy tanks. It had stripped away the aura of invincibility from German armor. In doing so, it reshaped the course of the battle. The climax was not just a turning point in the Ardennes, but a moment that marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's final offensive. The snow of the Ardennes would bear witness to countless tragedies, but also to the resilience of men armed with determination and a weapon finally capable of matching their enemy. The roar of the 90mm gun echoed across the frozen forests as a declaration that the line would not break. At the height of the battle, when the outcome teetered on a knife's edge, this weapon became the decisive factor. In the climax of the Bulge, the Americans found their strength, and the Germans felt their invincibility crumble. It was the moment when the war's momentum shifted for good. When the bitter winter of 1944 finally gave way, the Ardennes was left scarred with the wreckage of steel and the memories of the men who fought there. The snow melted to reveal burned-out tanks, shattered villages, and forests torn apart by fire and shell. Yet among the devastation, one fact stood clear. The German offensive had failed and the Allies had held. In that story of survival, the 90mm gun earned its place as one of the decisive tools of victory. It had turned fear into resistance, and resistance into triumph, marking a moment when the tide of war shifted irreversibly against Hitler's armies. The legacy of the 90mm gun was more than just the destruction it wrought on German armor. It represented the resilience of American soldiers who endured the cold, the fear, and the overwhelming pressure of battle. It symbolized the adaptability of a nation that could recognize a weakness, answer it with innovation, and deliver a weapon in time to change the course of a campaign. Soldiers who once whispered about the hopelessness of facing Tigers and Panthers now told stories of watching them burn under American fire. Those stories lived on long after the Ardennes, reminders of how swiftly despair could be replaced by hope when the right tool was placed in the right hands. For the men who fought there, the memory of the 90mm was personal. To a tank crew, it was the moment when their gun finally spoke with authority. To the infantry, it was the reassurance that the looming shadow of a Tiger tank could be answered. To commanders, it was the confidence that their units could hold the line without sacrificing countless lives in vain. The sound of its recoil, the sight of its shells tearing into German steel, became etched into memory as the weapon that had leveled the battlefield. It was a bond between soldier and machine, forged in the harshest of winters. The legacy also extended beyond the Ardennes and the war itself. The success of the 90mm gun influenced the design philosophy of future American tanks. Firepower and protection were no longer secondary to speed, but essential elements of armored warfare. The M26 Pershing, armed with a 90mm, carried the lessons of the Bulge into the final months of the war and beyond. It foreshadowed the evolution of tanks in the Cold War era, where balance between armor and firepower would define military strategy for decades. The weapon became not just a tool of victory, but a blueprint for the future. Yet, perhaps its greatest legacy was the lesson it offered about the nature of war itself. Victory in the Ardennes was not only about numbers or even about weapons, but about the will to adapt under pressure. The 90mm gun was born from necessity, shaped by urgency, and tested under the most desperate conditions. Its story was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, solutions could be found, and hope could be restored. It was proof that technology, when paired with human determination, could alter the course of history. As the Ardennes campaign closed and the Allies pushed into Germany, the roar of the 90mm faded into the background of larger battles, but its mark remained indelible. It had been the weapon that gave soldiers back their confidence, that denied the Germans their final gamble, and that helped ensure the road to victory remained open. In every burned-out Panther, in every halted Tiger, its legacy was written in steel and fire. The gun had not only pierced armor, it had pierced the myth of German invincibility. The story of the 90mm gun is ultimately the story of a turning point. In the snow and silence of winter, when defeat seemed possible, it stood as the voice of resilience. It was the moment when American soldiers could look across the battlefield and know that they had the strength to fight back and to win. Long after the last shots of the war were fired, the memory of that winter and the weapon that defined it endured. The 90-millimeter gun was not just a piece of artillery, it was a symbol of endurance, adaptation, and the enduring will to prevail against all odds.